Hey, I'm Kai from Flamenco Explained. In this video, we're going to take a look at the concept of a 9 chord and how we use them a lot in flamenco, right? And hopefully I'll do this in a way where you don't have to know pretty much anything about theory. The 9 chord is something that's called, it's a tension, right? When I was in school, they called these tensions. I think now they call them extensions because some people didn't like that word, tension. Don't know why. It's one that works on most chords really nicely and that we use a lot in flamenco and in music generally. What you need to know is that the 9 is a note that's a whole step above the root of the chord, right? So if I'm playing an A chord, right, the 9 would be a B. But rule of thumb for almost all tensions is that you're not going to put them really low in the chord, generally on the guitar, especially not replace the root with, right, that does not sound as nice as that, right? So here, instead of putting the B here, I'm putting it here, right? So that's something that you'll play around with as you get the concept. But again, so here's our A, right? A whole step above it is the 9, right? And you can do this on almost any chord. But there's also something called a flat 9 and a sharp 9, which, as you can imagine, a flat 9 is a half step below the 9, and a sharp 9 is a half step above. Probably the simplest way to show you, right, is por medio in flamenco, right? Voicings that we use that have the 9s. Right? And these are really common voicings, but let's look at the most common one, which is the C9 that we use all the time. A C major, right, has a C on top. A C7, right, now we have the flat 7, but we still have the C on top. Right, remember the 9 is a whole step above the root, and the root doesn't have to be the lowest note in the chord. So the C on a C chord, any C is a root, right? So that note D is the 9, which is why this chord is a C9. We're going to get into a little persnickety thing about calling a chord a C9 in just a minute. But this is a C9, so this shape, wherever I take it, right? If I played it here, that would be an E flat or a D sharp 9, and I probably wouldn't play that open string, right? And again, you don't need to know theory to know that that open E doesn't belong. You just need to use your ear and say, nope, I'm gonna mute that string. I don't want that involved. So this shape is a dominant chord with a 9, right? So this, for example, is a D9. Now, a minor chord has the 3rd lowered. So in this case, we're gonna take this same shape. This index happens to be the 3rd. We're gonna lower it 1 fret. Now I have a D minor 9, right? The 9 doesn't change. So D minor 9, D9. And when we're playing flamenco, generally we're doing D minor, right? The E is the 9 there. C9, and then here's a really cool chord, right? It's this shape, right? But the index basically falls off the guitar. And you can even add it here, right? That's the 5th of the chord. And we get that sound, right? So, of the 4 chords, right, this D minor can have a 9, the C can have a 9, the B flat can have a 9, but the A has what we call a flat 9, right? Which is this chord that's so distinctive to flamenco. So, it's a half step above the root, and it gives us the sound of flamenco, the flat 9 on a triad. So I'm going to get into a little bit of what I was talking about before, that persnickety thing. When we call a chord C9, there's a convention in music theory that means it's a dominant chord, which means it has a flat 7 in it, or that it's a 7 chord with a 9. So I wouldn't call this chord an A flat 9 because it doesn't have the flat 7 in it, right? Do you need to know this? It's helpful to know that you're not going to play a dominant on the tonic in flamenco. Normally we would call this an A add 9. So if you ever see that, the reason we say add 9 is we're specifically saying this is not a dominant chord, it's a triad with a added flat 9, right? So really it would say A add flat 9, not A add 9. Simple way to learn these, and these voicings can obviously be used in any key. So if we're playing in the granadina key, which is everything's a whole step up, I would just move everything up, right? E minor 9, D9, C9, right? And here I would play either a triad with a flat 9 or one of the more distinctive granadina chords for the B. Right? So these chords, this shape is super useful. And just one more little detail that I want to show you. So this, we said, is a C9, right? Because it has the flat 7. I could also play what we call a C major 9, right? It's a very different sounding chord, right? Because when I don't have that flat 7 makes this a dominant chord, which is why we call it a C9 with no other descriptor. If I move the flat 7 to natural 7, now I get this major 7 sound. Now that's not going to make sense to play this chord in por medio, right? Because what we really want is that sound, but it might work in this key, right? So you can play around with those, but nice to know that the major 9s look very similar, but with the major 7 in there. So por medio, it's super easy because these voicings are so important, and anytime we have the root on the 5th string, it's very easy to grab a 9 chord, right? Also, this shape, very important shape to know, this is just an aside, but this shape, right, it's the root, the 3rd, and the flat 7. It gives us a dominant sound, and very often with the open strings, it'll work. So it's a nice one to play around with and just see, like, does that work? Right? In granadina, I think it works really nicely. Por medio, it's not going to work because we have that B natural, which is a little weird. Now, if we play por arriba, right, E Phrygian, our roots are going to be on the 6th string. It's not quite as easy. Well, there is one easy way to grab the 9s, which is, right, here's our root, right, that's A. We're going to play A minor. That's also A, right? So remember, I said don't put your 9 way down in the chord because that would give you a weird sound. But if we play it here, right, a whole step above, we get a very nice sound, and we can do that throughout, right? This is minor. Here we got a dominant chord. I can add the 9 to this. I can add it here. And on the E, as I said, I'm not going to add the natural 9. I'm going to add the flat 9. Right? Which brings me to a really important final point. That 9 can change everything. And when we're playing, for example, bulerías, very often we will use that one note to completely change the key that we're playing in, right? So if we're here, there's really no question that we're in this key, right? That one chord tells us. Very often in a bulería, singers will sing in a slightly different key, right? So it looks, we're still in A, but instead of flat 9, we're playing the natural 9, right? Not B flat, but B natural. And suddenly, we're in A major, right? So that one note, right? This B flat tells us that we're Phrygian, and the B natural makes it very clear because this B natural is not in this key, A Phrygian. So this note immediately pulls us out into a different key, right? So the 9s are really important, and they're basically, they sound really pretty, but they're kind of innocuous, right? They're not going to really mess with a chord. So it's almost always an option to play around, find the 9, and it's also really good for your brain to force yourself to kind of think like, okay, I'm on D, right? So what would the 9 be? It's going to be a whole step above, which is an E, so you might add it here, because we know this voicing, but you also know that that's an E, right? So suddenly that open string is the 9, and you can use that to your advantage, for example. Right? Rather than try to grab it here, you can grab it here, right? And one final thing, you may have heard this little, right? I love this. This is the root, and then the 5th of the chord, and then here's the root again, right? So a whole step above is the 9, right? So you can use this to kind of pretty up your power chords, right? So you can get them on all your chords if you want, but you can also do power chords with a 9, and they sound pretty fantastic, and they transpose perfectly to the other keys.